But some things did work. And so this is the Virgin of Guadalupe. She's dressed up for her feast day. And the neighborhood did all of this dressing up. All we provided was this little stone altar and the image itself and just the little roof structure, which is actually a sort of Japanese-inspired architecture. This is a little nod to our multicultural community. So the first year, they dressed her up, and I was thrilled like that had happened. And by a few years later, she was just getting, tremendous love. There was a neighbor that came and swept and cared for this area every day, never came to church except on the Virgin of Guadalupe's feast day, but meticulously cared for, planted rose bushes, in fact, took out all of the drought-tolerant landscaping that was planted around this area and replaced it with beautiful flowering bushes, which the community deemed much more appropriate to adorning the Virgin. And people started to use the space too. So this is a mañanitas, an early morning session to honor the Virgin on her feast day. And these are little kids dressed up as Juan Diego, who's one of the key characters in the Virgin of Guadalupe story. There's another little Juan Diego. People brought their images from home to be blessed. It became a community place of gathering and prayer. And this is actually bringing together the graffiti and the community prayer. This is a little memorial that showed up actually on one of the stones that supports the Virgin of Guadalupe. And somebody's written the name of some loved one. We never knew the story of this person. And for months, maintained this little memorial of fresh flowers for whoever this person was. And wasn't totally in love with the idea of painting on the rocks, but this touched my heart and my soul that we had created a place where somebody had come to remember someone that they loved. One of the things that we realized early on was that people were not going to come inside on their own. And so we did a tremendous amount of taking church outside. And at first we borrowed a lot of people from neighboring churches, from friends, and eventually gathered our own crews. But this also traces back a little bit to the banana trees, because there's a tremendous Latin American tradition of public processions during Holy Week in particular. And we started doing these Holy Week processions, and they became famous in Koreatown. And people would come out and watch them as they went by. People would join, people would bring their kids, people would take pictures. It would show up on Twitter. And we had music. You can see the tuba in the background from one of the bands that practiced in our space. And it really kind of became a thing. We would do this on Good Friday, right at rush hour. Koreatown's a busy urban neighborhood. And we sometimes had several hundred people walking the streets and praying the Stations of the Cross. And we also hosted a number of community celebrations that involved street liturgy, and eventually would actually come inside the church. So this procession starts on the street and ends in the church. Now, you remember the cake in the window. So this is a visit from our bishop, Diane Bruce. And I asked some of our newer Oaxacan parishioners if they would take charge of getting a cake. And this is what we got. This is not what I had imagined or pictured when I asked for a cake, but it came actually from the bakery that you saw the beautiful cake from earlier. And it says, "Welcome, Bishop." And it was like the bishop's very own wedding cake. And we had a crowd big enough that we ate every last piece of this entire beautiful multi-tiered cake. And it was what the community had deemed appropriate for celebrating a visit of the bishop. And if any of you know Diane Bruce, she loved it. She was all about this big, fancy, tall bishop cake. And so then these are some of my last slides. I'm going to run through them quickly. But you remember the palm in the window. And we started doing Palm Sunday processions. And one year, people asked if it would be okay, in addition to the palm crosses, if they made a few traditional palm things of their own. And I said, sure. Like, I didn't really know what that meant exactly, but I figured more palms, the better. And this is what they brought. And these are just different families, and each family showed up with some kind of palm construction that was unique to their family tradition and had clearly taken all day to make. And it turned out to be just a little bit of a competition. And this is why I put Don Gerardo last, because he was known for, he was not going to ever let anyone outpalm him. So every year he would show up with the biggest, best, fanciest palm. But a couple years in, somebody took me aside and they said, I know he's always got the biggest palm, but he uses a glue gun. And that's just not traditional. So glue gun and all. Pride of place for Don Gerardo's winning palm submission. And then this is intentionally the last slide. So this is a full church. And in some sense, how fun to start a story with an empty church and end a story with a full church. But I do want to say, like, that's not really the story. You could find full church pictures at the beginning and empty church pictures at the end. All of this was a journey and a process, and all of it was always a work in progress and has suffered many setbacks during COVID, as many of you have in your congregations. And it suffered setbacks when I left, despite my best efforts not to make it about me. I was the first Episcopal priest that any of these people had ever met. And that's always a hard transition. And I'm on the other end of that transition at Misa Magdalena now, following the fabulous Sarah Beth Goodwin, who was the first Episcopal priest that most of the Misa Magdalena members had ever met. And it was just not the same to be the second Episcopal priest that people have had. So it was a journey. And the other thing is that we kept getting back out there and we kept seeing new things. One of the things that actually kind of broke my heart going back to look at pictures from 2011 was that there are no pictures of people living in tents. And there are now almost 40,000 people living on the streets of the city of Los Angeles. And Koreatown's one of the places where people are concentrated. And everywhere you look in Koreatown, there are people living in tents. I mean, literally everywhere you look. And I knew that had gotten much, much worse in the time that I was at St. Mary's, and that actually learning about and accompanying our homeless neighbors became a big part of St. Mary's ministry that's not really reflected in any of these pictures. But I hadn't really realized that in 2011, it just wasn't even really a thing. And it gave me a different perspective too on the sort of conversations about the intractable homeless problem in Los Angeles. It does feel intractable, both to the people who are living it and the people who are trying to manage the streets. But it actually hasn't always been how it is now. And that suggests that maybe it doesn't always have to be how it is now. And as a longtime activist around living wages, We said 25 years ago in Los Angeles that if people don't get paid more, eventually one of the things they're going to have to give up is housing. And that is what's happened in LA. And so, anyway, that's just a reminder that this is not a one-time deal. This is something we started doing every year. And it was as we saw our neighborhood change and develop that St. Mary's call to ministry continued to evolve. And it was really that call and following that call that has kept St. Mary's alive, not being able to fill the church on command, or even produce a beautiful cake and a good show when the bishop comes to visit. So that's my St. Mary's story.